Worms. Ocean Vuong joins us on today's Fully Booked Chats. We will discuss poetry and writing as a safe space for healing. This discussion is moderated by Dawn Lanuza, Filipino author and poet. Ocean Vuong is the author of the critically acclaimed poetry collections Night Sky with Exit Moons and Time is a Mother, as well as the New York Times best-selling novel On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. A recipient of the 2019 MacArthur Genius Grant, he is also the winner of the Whiting Award and the T.S. Eliot Prize. His writings have been featured in The Atlantic, Harper's Magazine, The Nation, The New Republic, The New Yorker, and The New York Times. Born in Saigon, Vietnam, he currently lives in Northampton, Massachusetts. Dawn Lanuza writes contemporary romance, young adult fiction, and poetry. She has two first loves, music and writing, and is lucky enough to surround herself with them. She started to self-publish in 2014 with her debut romance novel, The Boyfriend Backtrack, which was eventually published by Anvil Publishing. In 2016, she also self-published her first poetry collection, The Last Time I'll Write About You, which debuted #1 on Amazon's Hot New Releases and has stayed on its bestseller chart for over a year before it was re-released into an expanded and revised edition by Andrews McNeill Publishing. Everyone, let's welcome Ocean and Dawn.
Hi, Ocean. So nice to meet you.
Hi, Dawn. Glad to be here.
Welcome. Yeah, welcome to Fully Book Chats. Before we get started in our discussion, we'd like to know where you're calling us from.
I am in Northampton, Massachusetts.
Right. And currently, are you reading anything at the moment? Could you share us the title of the book?
Right now, I'm reading. Oh God, I'm drawing a blank. Oh, that's right. I'm rereading Donna Tartt's *The Secret History*. It's a very
Oh,
dark academia vibe, and it's a perfect read for the end of autumn, where everything here, all the leaves are gone and they're on the ground, and it's all very erudite, dark undergraduate vibes. Which is, and I live across
nice.
Smith College, so that's very prescient.
Nice. I was actually thinking of asking you to paint us a picture of where you are, and you gave it to us without me asking it. So thank you for that.
Right?
Yeah. And then I guess for starters, I think it would be nice if our readers and viewers could get to know you better. They might think the name Ocean is interesting. For me, I find it really interesting and beautiful. So I guess I'm just curious to find out like if there's an interesting story behind the name Ocean.
Uh, I guess in the Anglophone tradition, the name Ocean is rare, um, but in Vietnamese, it's probably as the name is Hai, and it's as common as like an Andrew. It's not as
Mm,
common as a John, but as common as an Andrew in the English tradition. But my mother thought that it would also be popular in America. And so she would just have to translate it to
ah,
English, and there would be many other oceans. There would be as many as common in America as there were in Vietnam. So, but it's a erroneous assumption. But I really love that assumption about her, that she just thought what was true in Vietnam would also be true in
mm.
America. And she says, "I'm going to name my son a very normal name," and then it was not. So
That's wonderful. Yeah. All right. So that's interesting to say that Ocean is kind of like an Andrew in Vietnam. I think we have some names also in the Philippines. I was named Dawn because I was just born at the break of dawn, I guess, and my
oh,
mother
that's
just kind of
beautiful.
took that literally. Yeah. And so I just want to get this chat started with, I guess, how I first met you or read you. It was in 2018. It was with your book, Night Sky with Exit Wounds.
Mhm.
Um, I was actually in a library. I don't think I even checked out your book. I read it in one sitting.
Oh,
Um, And at that time I felt like I was going through, I call it like a winter in my life. And I guess you would kind of assume what that meant. Like it was a very sad period. And I felt like when I read your book, I kind of saw like the sadness in there, the pain. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who has reached out to you or talked to you about, feeling that your book spoke to them. So I'm just wondering, like, if anyone ever approached you saying this to you, like, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I get many responses from readers of all types, and I'm still I'm still surprised. That first of all, I'm surprised that the novel is as big as it is because
Mm,
I'm a poet writing a novel, and I never really expected. I just was happy to write a novel. I didn't, and all my heroes were very obscure writers. Juna Barnes, avant-garde writers like Banu Kapil, Anne
mm,
Carson, who was, very well read, but certainly not New York Times best-selling writers. Um, Gwendolyn Brooks's novel, which is a really beautiful book called Maud Martha, experimental novel she wrote in the 50s. Um, and so when this book took off, I'm someone much smarter than I can, probably with a PhD, would be able to make sense of it. But I'm just happy that it it's doing what it does, but it's still a surprise to me.
mm,
I I'm an author that really believes in whatever the reader feels is true. I would never say to a reader that whatever how they interpret my book is wrong. There's no such thing as a wrong way to read, in my opinion, because
mm,
reading is a performance art, right? If I held a book up in my hands, it would just be text. It is not story until it's read. And so every act of reading requires a kind of performance wherein the stage is the reader's mind. Like, for example, if I were to say the word winter,
mm,
it's spelled exactly the same for everybody in the English tradition. But your understanding of winter might be very different from my understanding. I know my relatives in Vietnam have a very different understanding of winter. Some folks in Australia has a completely reversed timeline of winter, um, and very different from where I am now in New England, and for
mm,
people in San Diego. So just because there's text does not mean there is universal conclusion. And so I think the best any author can expect is to just be read. So I'm surprised and delighted, but for me, I think every reader's experience of a book is true, and there's no
mm,
wrong experience of a book.
mm. Yeah, I agree. And then for you, since we are talking about like how your book has affected the readers, but for you when you were writing it, how can you um, say the whole writing process, like whether it's your poetry or your novel, has helped you with your own healing if you're ever, processing any emotions or any events in your life?
Oh, it's hard. It's a difficult question. I don't know if
Mm,
if I'm healed. I don't know
mm,
if writing. I think writing can heal.
mm,
I'm very skeptical of the movement that that came out of a response of the confessional school of poetry in the 60s, a very
mm,
reactionary movement in America, particularly, that um, is very skeptical of any art that heals, because it's often believed that anything that heals is less than art, right? Because if it has the function of healing, then it must not be serious, right? It must be therapeutic.
mm,
But I think that's incredibly elitist and wrong. Um, so I think healing is possible, but I don't go to writing to heal. I
mm,
go to writing to really have a different definition of happiness. actually. I think, am I healed in my art? No. But do I achieve a kind of contentment in making my experiences felt? To write a
Mm,
book, to build an architecture of ideas, right? We have architecture of buildings, but a book is an architecture of ideas. And when you make such a structure, you invite folks to come in and embody it. And there's a kind of delight in accomplishing that. Now, in the long haul, is that healing? Perhaps. I might be too young to say determinately and confidently that I am healed because of my work. Um,
mm,
but I think here's something interesting that I'm starting to understand. If I had a choice of healing or finding the delight in accomplishing a work of art that allows other people to share my experience, I think I would choose the latter over the
mm,
former. I don't know if healing is the final destination
mm.
that everyone talks about it as such. Maybe that's because I'm a Buddhist and the only healing is non-existence.
Mm,
Um,
mm, mm.
and so I think I expect to suffer here, and my goal then is to suffer well or to
Mm,
suffer skillfully. And I
yeah.
think for me, literature is one of the best ways to suffer skillfully because you do it with others.
Mm, that's wonderful. That's so interesting. But I do agree. Like, yeah, I don't think a lot of people would be confident enough to say at this moment that they're healed. It's always, I think, a process, an ongoing process. But yeah, um, I love that you said suffering successfully. That's such a wonderful way of framing suffering. Yeah, and so I guess let's just dive in more into to how you write, right? So you write poetry and you write novels. Obviously, those are two very different formats. So I was wondering, like, is there a different process when you write poetry versus when you write novel? Like, how do you get into that headspace?
Yeah, it's very different. The poem is more like painting.
Mm,
It's, you know, it's more about following the language, the sort of radical possibilities in the line break. Um, so it's really charged with change because every few lines, every few words, you have to confront the line break. And there's all kinds of decisions one has to make. Whereas the novel, you can be lulled into space.
mm,
And but the novel has the advantage of creating an ecosystem,
mm,
following characters through time. Uh, Poetry kind of resists temporal time, whereas the novel demands it, right? Day after day, what does a character do in the
mm,
aftermath of an event? And I think that the novel is very tight in that way. It demands more concrete time. And so I worked on my first book of poems for 8 years, and I got kind of really good and also really cheesy at getting out of the poem. Like, I
mm,
felt, oh, this poem's getting really hot. I know how to close the poem and kind of
mm,
out the kitchen window. And I felt like I was cheating after a while. This is one of the toughest things about doing something for a long time.
mm,
Eventually, you get too good for your own good. And I don't mean good in quality. I mean good in like, your tricks. And I said, oh my God, I keep on jumping out the window at the right time. And I need to challenge myself to stay. And the novel was the best way to do that because
mm.
you can't stop it. You have to go to the next chapter. You have to follow these people through time. And I was really excited about that challenge. And that's
Mm.
major differences.
Mm. You mentioned that you wrote your first poetry collection in like 8 years. How long did it take you to write your novels?
The novel took 4 years. Yeah.
Mm. Okay, so half that time.
Yeah, the poem. Well, if I wrote my novel first, maybe that would took 8 years too. There's a caveat with 8 years because a lot of that 8 years was, juvenilia. It's,
Mm.
maybe 4 of those 8 years was learning how to write, and making a lot of mistakes. Right.
Mm.
Of course, you make mistakes all the time, but most of my the mistakes versus the improvements were very lopsided. Right.
Yeah.
A lot of mistakes, very few improvements. But now it's a little more equal. So I think there's a caveat with those 8 years. A lot of that was just trying to find a way to know what I wanted to do. I hate the
Mm.
term find my voice. I don't believe in a voice
Mm.
that's found. I believe voice is a matrix of yourself and what you
Mm.
absorb, including what you hear on the street and the people around you. I don't
Mm.
think it's some kind of hunt where you find your voice. Um, but I didn't know what I wanted, what was important to me, what I wanted literature to do for myself. And that takes a long time. For some people, it takes 10 years. I think I was very lucky that I was able to do
Mm.
it. But yeah, so if I wrote the novel first, I think that would also take 8 years.
A longer time. Yeah. And since we are talking about you studying literature, and you mentioned like you have some authors that you find are influential to you, when you were studying literature or your writing courses, like um, were there any teachers or professors that you found that are also influential in how you were kind of on how your writing turned out to be later on?
Uh, every single one. Well, I was a failed. I failed into literature.
What do
I
you mean by
started.
that?
I started as a business student and
Ah.
studied international marketing at Pace University.
Mm.
I got a scholarship to study there, and my family, first generation to go to college, were very proud.
Mm-mm.
But I only lasted 4 weeks, and then I
Oh,
dropped out. I actually didn't even technically drop out. I just left the building and never returned.
okay.
I was just so depressed, because here I am. The school is at the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge, the famous Brooklyn
Mm.
Bridge. And I would just look out the window every class, looking at the bridge, the sunlight hitting the bridge in the evening,
Mm.
lights up with this beautiful golden hue. And I just thought about all my heroes, Hart Crane and Walt Whitman writing about this bridge. And I was like, here I am learning how to lie for a corporation, right? That's what marketing is. It's lying
Uh-huh.
for corporations. And I thought, what would happen if I lied for myself? And that's what
Mm.
poetry is. Poetry is lying for nothing. And I think that's why a lot of authoritarian regimes crack down on the poets first, because
Mm.
people are very nervous when people lie for nothing, right?
Mm.
They get very it says a lot about the world we're in, where people get very comfortable when you say, I work in marketing, because, oh, you're lying for profit. Oh, I work in politics. Oh, I lie for votes.
Mm.
Oh, you work in weapons development. Oh, I lie to create the death machine. But when you say I'm a poet, people get very nervous. They say, what do you mean? Why would you do that? Why would you lie for nothing? But I also think that's the power of the poet, is that our objectives cannot be pinpointed. Sometimes there is no objective, right? And dare I say, maybe the objective is language itself. Maybe the objective is just joy. But whatever the case, I dropped out, and I was too ashamed to go home to my mother empty-handed and say, Ma, I failed.
Mm.
So I couch surfed. I slept at friends' house. Sometimes I would sleep in kitchens
Mm.
underneath the dining table. And I would go to the library in the day. And at night, I would go to bars to read poems. So
Mm.
they would have open mics in the back of bars. And after the open mic, you pay for $5 extra. And then somebody would hold a workshop in the back of a bar. And that's how I learned how to write a sonnet, a ghazal,
Right.
a sestina, a pantun. I didn't learn those things in the academy. I learned them in a bar.
Wow.
But it reminds me that poetry is a communal
Mm.
technology. We've always learned in the back of a bar, right? in the village, in the society, that poetry is not this ivory tower. It's amongst the people. It's a democratic art, and it didn't get any more democratic than that. And slowly, someone said you might as well get an English degree.
Mm.
So I signed up to get an English degree in the CUNY system, and I ended up at Brooklyn College. And I thought my mother can't read, so I'll just get an English degree and tell her it's a marketing degree, and that's what I did.
Uh, did she ever find out later on that it wasn't a marketing degree?
No, no, she never did. It didn't matter.
Oh,
She was just happy to see me in the cap and gown.
mm,
But
that's funny.
I didn't want to explain to her all this stuff, so I just said, "Look, it's a
Yeah,
mark, you know."
and then you just ended up writing books. That's so funny. Okay, and then I also learned that you're actually teaching right now, which is quite a shift. And I think I saw one of your interviews where you referred to teaching as more of your career, and being a writer is more of a phenomena for you, which I kind of get. So I was just wondering, like, since you have this background of, yes, you did study English, but you had this background of, you know, you started from the bars, right? So if I was a student, like if we were planning to be a student, like what would we expect from an Ocean Vuong class?
Um, Rigorous scholarship.
Mm.
Um, I think for me, it's very important to read the canon in order to minimize it. Right.
Mm.
The English canon is valuable because it comes at a great cost, and the great price of that canon is often colonialism. Right. So the Enlightenment was made possible because Europe decided to look at the global South as a resource of labor and goods. And so the farmer, the agrarian farmer in Europe who lost his hours in the fields from the medieval feudal system now got to go inside and read and think for hours. Now that privilege of time that developed the Enlightenment was built on the backs of, you know, colonized peoples.
Mm.
And so to me, but that created a lot of powerful, effective literature, from the 1600s all the way to the 20th century. And so I think for me, engaging with it thoroughly, not as a monolith, but as one category of a canon, a Eurocentric canon, as opposed to a Japanese canon, a Chinese canon, an African canon, a South
Mm.
African canon, a Latin American canon. So, in a way, to kind of read thoroughly and read against greatness.
Mm.
It's really important. I tell my students this because we have this idea that we are late to history, which we are. But the problem in literary pedagogy is that we're often taught to encounter monolithic pantheons
Mm.
rather than investigate them, right? So you have classes in the average American university uh, that looks like the syllabus that looks like the best mid-century American novels, the
Mm.
best post-world lyrics, the greatest Victorian poems, right?
Yeah.
And when you put pressure on how greatness is defined,
Mm.
you ask the word why 2 or 3 times, the argument falls apart, right? Or it cannot be repeated. The guidelines cannot be replicated across time. In other words, greatness quickly falls into ideology. So it's so important for me to get my students to think this way, to read everything as investigation rather than blind celebration. You can
Mm.
celebrate after, but you have to investigate first, which is why I'm thoroughly against the trend of canceling certain authors, right? Canceling Whitman or what have you. I said, no, that's historic. If we ignore it, we take ourselves out of the conversation. We don't actually control the conversation. we take ourselves, we remove ourselves, we cede the ground to someone else, and the dominant forces will continue the conversation without us. And it is way too costly to take ourselves out of the room, because historically, people who look like me and you are rarely invited into these rooms. So while we're here, we have to reframe the hermeneutic interpretation of the canon in ways that are more robust and accountable to history. And then you take what's useful for yourself, and then you move forward. It's kind of like what Emerson said. Emerson said, one should read as if sifting for gold. Well,
Mm.
that's a really wonderful way to look at it, because it assumes that the canon is not all gold, right? You have to find the pieces of it for yourself.
Mm.
A British Marxist Christian, one of my favorite cultural critics, Terry Eagleton, probably put it best. He said, the canon is all right. A lot of it is boring. And he says, I would be hard pressed to find anything in the canon much better than The Office, the TV series, The Office. And I said, you know what?
Uh-huh.
He's not exactly wrong there, right?
Mm. I agree. All right. And so I guess for people who are unable to join your classes, I guess my question next is what would your advice be for these writers, especially authors of color? What would be your advice if they ever want to get into writing and eventually like publishing? Yeah.
The greatest thing you can do for yourself, I think, and this is just my opinion,
Mm.
is to ignore the reader. The greatest respect you can give a reader is to ignore it.
Mm.
I don't mean this glibly. I mean this earnestly. Um, because as soon as you start to imagine an ideal reader, you start to reduce and constrain yourself to pandering to this imagined reader.
Mm.
And often you imagine the reader um, perceiving you as someone in multiple categories, right? So, for example, you say, oh, if there's a reader who expects me to perform
Mm-hmm.
queer Asianness, then I better do all these things. And so you turn yourself into a machine of subject matter, a theme
Mm.
machine, rather than an individual. And I think I'm most excited when I'm reading an author, and it's more like I'm looking over their shoulder as
Mm.
they're digging. Those are the
Mm.
best books, because you feel like the author has something much more urgent to say or discover, or they don't even feel like they know it yet.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you have the author who really, you can tell, is expecting a certain kind of readership or pandering to a kind of expectation. So they're kind of sitting across the table from you, almost as if they're being interviewed. It's like, well, here's what you want me to say. I'm going to say it this way because I'm
Mm.
part of this category. I'm this check mark, this identity. And then so they turn themselves into a commodity rather than a way of thinking. And I think it's a great loss when the sentence becomes a commodity and
Mm.
rather than an enactment of thought. So I would always tell my students, and I try to remind myself this, forget the reader. The reader will be there. The reader
Mm.
is a human being. And if one human being finds something valuable and surprising, that is you. If you're the writer, I always have this faith. And I know it's woo-woo, for all of our intellectual discourse, we shy away from faith. But I do think at the end of the day, it takes a lot of faith to sit alone in your room, staring at the blank page, and you write a line and you say, my goodness, I don't know if anyone would care for this, but I care for this.
Mhm.
I think this is surprising and interesting and weird. Everything I know tells me I should erase it, but I believe in it. I think someone else will also. I hope
Mm.
someone else will. And that's it. That's the faith. Is entering this absolute hidden place, this absolute mystery, and praying and hoping that someone else will look at this and say, oh yeah, I'm just as weird. I'm glad somebody verbalized this strangeness.
Mm,
And I think that is actually the most exciting thing. And you can get there quicker when you just completely ignore the reader.
mm,
That's the greatest respect you can ever give someone.
I love that. I agree, but I think it takes also quite an experience for you to completely, remove that. I think a lot of some of the challenges of like beginner writers are they always would like to hear about, oh, what do they think about this? And then I think taking in those words and those criticisms, like what you said, they kind of build this, oh, what do people expect from me next? Which I think is, you know, might be a danger to, keeping it authentic for yourself, writing for yourself first, writing what you enjoy first.
You're right. You're so right. Because I think everything in our world works like that, right?
Mm,
You walk into an office, oh, how does my boss see me? How does my peer see me? You walk into school, oh, how am I perceived? You walk in the
mm,
street to the market, oh, how am I seen? How am I? So our survival, we evolved with the fear of judgment, right? That's
okay.
part of how we survived as a species. So in a way, to do this as an author is to ask yourself to go against evolution, to go
Mm,
against everything that made us who we are as a species. And I think that's why it's truly very, very difficult. And that's why so many authors have tricks. You know, Flaubert would sniff rotten apples. Um, a Baldwin had to write in public. He had to be seen, right? He had to go out to the cafes, and he wanted to be held accountable to himself.
mm.
He had to be perceived all the time while he was writing. Really fascinating. Myself, I like to put on boots. I put on military boots.
Oh,
Um, that's my little ritual. It's like it tricks my mind into saying, okay, Ocean, you have to go somewhere very, very far. You have to go
mm.
on a long, long march with your soul. Um, and so even at night, like at 2 in the morning, I'll lace up my boots before I. So whatever you can do, any ritual, begging ancestors, lighting incense,
Mm,
whatever it takes to take you to the unknown, it is unnatural. I think we fetishize naturalness, right? Oh, she's a natural at this, and we prize that. But I actually think it's really beautiful to lean into what's unnatural. We're doing
mm.
something very unnatural, and it takes a lot of hard work and skill. But the culture values the phenom and the prodigy over the laborer. You know,
Mm,
magazines love to talk about the writing prodigy as if they just
right.
blew up out of nowhere. It's
Yep.
also very violent language. She blew up. He bursted on the scene like it's a robbery, you know.
Mm-mm.
But what's actually very unsexy but very true is that it's all labor. It's a lot of hard work and
It's
it's a
true.
lot of doubt.
That's true. I love that. I love this advice. I hope all of our readers and viewers here could take that to heart and really, just do it for yourself first before you think of others. Yeah. And then this is the last question for me before we go to our fan questions. I know you have a book coming out. Could you give us a bit more of information about that?
One of my heroes, Lucille Clifton, used to write poems using the Ouija board.
Mm.
I'm too. I'm not brave enough to do that, but I like whatever works for her. Um, Maybe when I'm out of options, maybe I'll go towards that. But it's not for a while. But I think I'm in this book. I'll say it very broadly that On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous was kind of an artist statement.
Mm.
It was a blueprint. It's a book that rejected plot in a very stubborn way, in a very disobedient way to particularly Western values of storytelling, in order to make a claim for the importance of art making as an Asian American subject. And as a modern contemporary subject, period. The importance of articulation and art making in the time of war. The book was written in the shadow of the Bush wars of Afghanistan and Iraq and 9/11. Um, and so it was an artist statement, a blueprint. And this novel is me trying to make good on that artist statement, that blueprint, trying to manifest it in a more plotted, traditional way. And
Mm.
so I'm really, really excited. It's almost like if Unearth was talking the talk, this book now has to try to walk the walk.
Ah, interesting. So we're gonna go into your fan questions. So a few weeks ago, we actually asked our readers to send you a video of them asking you some questions. We chose three people for
Oh.
this. So yeah, so let's first hear from Firaz.
Ocean, I'm Firas, and my question is, if time is analogous to mothers, then what would you use for fathers? Thank you so much.
All right, so that's Firaz. So do you want me to repeat the question, or the question is here?
Oh,
So if
I'm question. Um, in my first book,
Mm.
I said the line, "Oh Father, oh foreshadow,"
Mm.
and perhaps that's what it is. Our fathers foreshadow us, and
Mm.
um, and I think the beauty of the foreshadow is that it hints at what's to come, but ultimately, there's a clever trick in the novel that some writers use is to present a foreshadow and then deny
Mm.
its inaction, right? So present its promise and then deny its reality, to kind of dodge the foreshadow. And I think, depending on how you feel about your father, how
Mm.
one's father is to them, you can either satisfy the foreshadow or deny it.
Mm. That's awesome. Okay, I do because I read Time as a Mother before getting into school, and then I reviewed Night Sky with Exit and I do notice that your father is much more present in Night Sky with Exit. Yeah. All right. Next question is coming from Mikey.
Good day. My question is, what's the most surprising thing you've learned while writing your books?
Okay.
The most surprising thing I learned as a writer, writing anything, is it's okay to scare yourself. Just don't be scared of yourself.
Mm.
And I think that difference is really important. Scare yourself in your work. Scare yourself in how you think and how you articulate. But don't be scared of it. Don't be scared of yourself. It's all just you. And in fact, I would argue that writing is the safest way to experiment. It's the
Mm.
safest way to
Explore.
be daring.
Mm.
And so really be daring and take as many risks as you can, because there are very few spaces in the world where you can take as many risks and still be in your room. Um, and historically, even then, so many writers take this risk and they're thrown in prisons or they meet the gallows or the firing squad. And that's still happening today. So realize that, remind yourself that when you sit at the desk, you're sitting at a long tradition of daring. Often we talk about a lot of writing rules, writing checklists, but at the core of it is this ability to dare, to
Mm.
try something no one else has tried before, or to go against all the rules set before you, and to be as open and free as you can.
I love that, a long tradition of daring. I love that word. Okay. Lastly, we have a question from Jenny.
Hello, I'm Jenny. Could you share with us how your writing process has evolved over the years, and specifically, how did it shape the creation of Time is Mother? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. I think it kind of piggybacks on what I just said. That when I first wrote, like any writer, but maybe specifically an Asian American writer, I was very uncertain about whether I was conforming to expectations, you know.
Mm,
So my first book was very conservative. It was a student's book. I'm proud of it, but it was very clearly a book where I was trying to show that I belong here. I was almost
mm,
asked to belong. Here are the things I've read. Here are the couplets with the perfectly balanced metaphors, perfectly restrained work. In that way, it's very conservative to the tradition. It
mm,
was almost like the students showing their work, right?
mm, mm, mm,
And I had to do that in order to build a foundation to explore and really invent. And I think we often talk about the avant-garde as a Napoleonic War metaphor. The vanguard is the group of soldiers that goes out to test the firing power of the enemy. And that is supposedly this very brave, exploratory avant-garde, the front guard. Um, and I think I started my career really wanting to be in that position, um,
mm,
like all of my heroes, you know, John Ashbery, Carlos Bolosa, uh,
mm,
Maxine Hong Kingston. These, to me, these were the vanguard writers. Um, and now I actually think there is something even more courageous than being on the vanguard. And if we were to keep this military metaphor, I would say it's the deserter.
mm,
It's the deserter who is the true avant-gardist, the one who says, wait a minute, I'm not going to go out and die for an emperor. I'm going to run I'm going to run away from both armies and
mm,
find my way home. And I think to me, that's where, if you look at my work in just a small body of work in 3 books,
mm,
by the time I got to Time as a Mother, on Earth I was veering away. By the time I got to Time as a Mother, I became a very proud deserter.
mm. Yep. I actually noticed that from reviewing Night Sky with Exodus last night and then reading Time as a Mother. I see, there's a distinction in there from where you started to where you are now. Yeah.
Oh,
So
thank you.
so thank you so much to Firas, Mikey, and Jenny for sending your questions. We are close to ending this chat. We are doing this game called Fast Talk. I'm not sure, Ocean, if you've already played this game. Basically, I'll just ask you a question and then you'll answer it the quickest as you can, like the first thing that comes to your mind. All right.
Okay.
Are you ready? Okay.
I think so.
All right. Let's start. Number 1, paperback or hardcover?
Paperback.
Okay. Number 2, writing in daytime or writing at night?
Night.
All right. Number 3, reading with music on or in silence?
Silence.
Okay. Number 4, happy endings or sad endings?
Sad everything.
Okay. And lastly, what are the 3 books that you always recommend?
Orpheus in the Bronx by
Mm.
Reginald Shepard. Anne Carson, Autobiography of Red.
I
Um,
love Anderson.
and Hikaru Nishida's Inquiry into the Good.
All right. Okay, so we'll take notes of those books. Hopefully they're in stock at Fully Booked. we'll go and get that. So that's actually the end of our chat for today, Ocean. Thank you so much for having the time to meet us. It's been a wonderful discussion with you. Yeah.
Thank you, Dawn, for your beautiful questions and for reading so carefully and reading like a scholar. Wonderful. And makes me a very happy professor.
Oh, thank you, Ocean. I will be looking forward to your book in 2025, and I'm sure our viewers as well. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Don't forget to grab a copy of Ocean's books, Time as a Mother, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, Night Sky with X Wounds on www.fullybookedonline.com. Everybody stay safe and keep on reading.